Ke tīmata tātou. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, ki te haurangi called Climate Action Through Legal Drafting, te kaupapa. My name is Debra Dorrington and I'm a property lawyer, and I'm joined by Nicole Xanthopol, a partner in the law firm Webb Henderson. Somewhere out there in the audience too is Michael Gartshaw. He's also from Webb Henderson. And these two head up the corporate team at that firm. Nicole looks after the banking and finance side of things, and Michael the M&A and corporate project matters. I'm telling you about Michael because he might join me a little bit later, join us at question time, particularly if there are questions that you wish to put if you work in that area of law. Nicole and I practice in different areas of law, but we share an interest in the relevance of climate change to our work. We're interested in the impact that it has on our legal advice that we give. We're interested in the impact that legal advice can have on climate action, both from an analysis of the risk and playing a support in that legal action role. One of the goals today was to try and bring together people who might be similarly motivated around climate change. We had hoped that it would be quite a collaborative event. It's a little bit difficult when it's virtual, but nonetheless, there will be an opportunity to ask questions and to provide comments. If you'd like, we'll look at them at the end. You can do that by using the Q&A function on your screen, down the bottom of the screen. Use that one rather than the chat one, because we'll be monitoring the Q&A tab. This presentation will be recorded, and that recording will be available. It'll be available from either Webb Henderson or from me, and it will also be available on the Auckland Climate Festival website. We'll email it out to you too, I think. Now change the screen, please. So one of the first things that I want to look at, let me change the slide. Yeah, there we go. I want to tell you about Lawyers for Climate Action. It's an organisation of New Zealand lawyers. It's been going for a couple of years now, and many of you may be part of this organisation already or may well have heard of it. It started out as a group of litigators interested in having a look at how they could take effective action in New Zealand against climate change using their skills as litigators. They've been in the news quite a bit. They've had been quite influential in the things that they have done, and the notable one, the most recent one, is the judicial review action that's been taken against the Climate Change Commission in relation to the advice that was given there. I'd encourage you to go to the website and have a look around Alkanzi and see what they've got there, the information, the reports, the media information that's there. But there are some other things that you can do as well in relation to that organisation. You can join if you want. It's open to lawyers and actually I think non-lawyers too. It only costs $50 a year, and you get to keep up with the sorts of things that they're doing and have the odd interaction socially as well. You can donate. They're always up for donations. The thing is run almost entirely by volunteers, so donations are certainly accepted. And you might choose also to volunteer to help out the organisation. One of the things that Alkanzi does is it marries together people who are willing to help out with providing advice, pro bono advice, and climate activists or people wanting to take climate action who need lawyers. So Alkanzi runs a marrying of the two together to help out there. It also invites people to volunteer to help out with projects that Alkanzi is doing. So if you're not up for the pro bono work, but you're interested in being available for some sort of project, there have been template letters, for example. There's been a toolkit created for helping lawyers to measure their carbon footprint. Then that might be something you want to do. And on their website, there are forms that you can fill in for either of those if you're keen on doing that. And if all of that's too much, then just consider following them on social media and sharing the different stories that are there. Can I have the next slide, please, Megan? I also want to tell you about the Chancery Lane project. So this also is a bunch of lawyers, this time from around the world. the numbers are getting higher. Last time I looked, I think it was about 1,600 or so lawyers that were involved. This is a pretty awesome resource for those of us who are interested in incorporating climate change thinking into our drafting. The Chancery Lane project drafts clauses for documents and makes them publicly available for anybody who wants to use them. And if you go onto their website, you'll see a raft of different clauses and also notes and information which you can access whenever you want to. They're drafted from the context of British law, so they're not the sort of thing that you can just pick up and dump into an ADLS lease, but they are going to be useful in identifying the relevant issues, the things that people might be thinking about, the things that you might want to consider in your own drafting and giving of advice. And there's work too to make them relevant to different nations around the world, and I'm sure that that will happen here in New Zealand. The Chancery Lane project has just very recently launched a net zero toolkit, this in a lead up to COP26, which is a bunch of clauses and supporting information, helping those who want to draft provisions about net zero requirements and net zero provisions, net zero expectations. The timing has been a little bit unfortunate in that they are running a webinar to introduce this new toolkit down here in Australasia, and the webinar is on right now. It starts in about 20 minutes. So it's a shame that we coincided with the timing, but nonetheless, theirs is being recorded, ours is being recorded. I'm sure the information will be able to be shared. The Chancery Loan project is running a number of different workshops and seminars over the next few weeks in the lead up to COP26, and you'll be able to see information about them on their website, and they're free to join. The information where you, they are webinars where you might participate and be involved in the preparation of documentation or simply learning about what's going on. So I encourage you to have a look at the Chancery Loan project website. I'm going to turn over to Nicole, who is going to give us some introduction to the legal framework, the context within which we're giving a presentation.
Thanks, Debra. Hi, everyone. It's nice to have you all here today, and thanks for your interest in this subject. Given the target audience for this was kind of lawyers or those in the legal arena, we thought we'd start with a bit of the law, so we start with the legal framework. So this is the start of our modern kind of legal framework is in the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. It's a legally binding international treaty on climate change that was signed by almost every nation in the world. The US did withdraw from it as a result of a decision during Donald Trump's presidency, but have now rejoined, we're pleased to say. The goal of the Paris Agreement that was agreed by all the parties was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, and to endeavour to limit that increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That went much further than the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. Each country sets their own emission reduction targets. They're known as nationally determined contributions, and those are reviewed every 5 years with the aim of raising ambition in each country. So New Zealand started off with their 2016 NDC, and that with the target of reducing emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. That was updated in April last year to match our new carbon zero regime. And that regime was introduced into law by the Carbon Zero Act, which was by way of amendment to the Climate Change Response Act of 2022. That legislation, New Zealand domestic legislation, sets a new target for New Zealand to reduce net emissions of greenhouse gases other than biogenic methane to zero by 2050. So that's our legal goal, is net emissions of greenhouse gases to zero by 2050. Biogenic methane have a different stepped approach, but trying to reduce those by 2030 to a certain level and 2050 to the next level. That legislation also established a framework for a series of emissions budgets, and those were intended to be stepping stones, are intended to be stepping stones towards the long-term target. and help with plans and policies to get to our long-term target. That legislation also established the new Independent Climate Change Commission, which began in December 2019, and that organisation is to provide expert advice to the government on New Zealand's climate change settings and monitoring, and with the goal of keeping successive governance on track to meet our long-term goals. The Climate Change Commission provided their report to the government in about June, July of this year, and are waiting for a result for some decisions from the government. The next piece of legislation, which is on its way through the process, is in relation to climate-related financial disclosure. Now, this is a regime that we're first in the world to do, with mandatory reporting required of large listed companies, banks, insurers and investment scheme managers predominantly. So that regime is about disclosing on keeping records, first of all, of climate related disclosure elements of their business, and reporting on, disclosing on governance, strategy, risk management and metrics and targets. So those 4 pillars, in the way that they are relevant to the climate related risks and opportunities of the relevant business. And they do that by producing annually climate statements that are publicly available and registered. And then there is there's a climate related disclosure framework which is being established by the XRB, and their first discussion document, which is on the first 2 pillars of governance and risk management, that's due out tomorrow. So that is in progress. Reporting for this regime will not be before 2023 at the earliest. But it's good to see that there are a number of businesses that are voluntarily reporting early. So the Super Fund and Westpac and Vector, amongst others, are showing real leadership in this area, which is great to see. The consequences of not complying with this piece of legislation are quite severe. Personal liability for directors of up to $500,000 and up to 5 years, and up to 5 years in prison. Entities, $2.5 million fine. So it's something to pay a lot of attention to. Other changes in legislation that are coming through: the Resource Management Act is intended to be replaced by 3 acts: the Natural and Built Environments Act, the Strategic Planning Act, and the Climate Adaptation Act. Even the names of those acts are more in tune with the environment than the old legislation, which is good to see. We can expect further regulation that'll be around probably standards for vehicles, buildings, land use, fuel. All these things will come in the future. There's also our mandatory reporting for climate related financial disclosure was based on the recommendations of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure. There's now a TNFD, which is in relation to nature, living nature. So soil, air and water. And so that was launched in just June of this year, the TNFD, and that will build on the structure of the TCFD. So we can expect more reporting in line with the TCFD reporting in relation to nature coming next. I'll now hand back to Debra to talk about some further developments in this area.
To talk about some other stuff. Yes. Great, thanks, Nicole. So the thing that I want to discuss briefly is representations that might be made by your clients. It might be made in the documents that you draft for them, or that might be made as part of their marketing, and you might be requested to give advice on, or they might actually just go to your understanding of the types of message that wants to get across in the documents that you're drafting. So there are all of the normal expectations and requirements that apply to representations in New Zealand, and warranties apply to representations around environmental issues or climate action. But of course, there's a little bit more than that too. The there are other watchdogs as well. The public watchers, activist groups watch what's going on, and they take action in relation to this. So there's an added layer, I suppose, of care that's needed. I want to talk about just a few examples of representations that have recently been made, either in New Zealand or in relation to something in New Zealand, to give you a taste of, how these have worked. And I acknowledge that these examples that I'm giving are actually, all of them, I think, about marketing. And you may not think that they directly affect the wording of your drafting, but I think that they're useful in giving you some insight into the mindset around climate action. The first one there relates to zero carbon gas, and it's actually some action that was taken by Auckland, the group that I was talking to you about at the beginning. First Gas supply LPG throughout New Zealand, and earlier this year they advertised that their gas, and they said New Zealand's heading towards zero carbon, so we're ensuring our gas is going zero carbon too. You know what that means for you? Absolutely nothing. You can continue doing what you love and help change the world without changing too much of yours. And it is the case that First Gas was investigating alternative carbon-free gas, zero carbon gas, but they weren't there yet. It's sometime down the road. So this, Auckland said, was greenwashing. It discourages people from actually taking action to avert climate catastrophe. It gave the impression that they didn't need to do anything. So they took action to the Advertising Standards Board, and the Advertising Standards Board said, yes, you need to change what you're saying and remove the advertisement. The second picture relates to a marketing campaign that was undertaken, or has been undertaken throughout the world by Converse, the guys who make the shoes. And this marketing campaign made the news. This is a picture here of a mural that is painted down in Eden Terrace, it's still there, in Karaka Street. And you probably can't read it up in the top right-hand corner there of that wall, but it says, created with paint that cleans the air. So around the world, murals were painted using this particular paint, and the claim was made that the paint works like a tree and that as it dries, it absorbs the CO2 that's in the air. So I said that this campaign made the news, but it made the news probably for the wrong reasons. Converse mural claims disingenuous, scientists say, was the type of headline that they got. The scientists said, yeah, okay, the paint does absorb CO2 when it's drying, but you're not thinking about the whole picture. There's not nearly enough CO2 absorbed during the drying process to cover the CO2 that's created during the process of making the paint. Can we have the next slide, please? The message is that telling some of the story, but not all of the story, is greenwashing. And here's an excerpt from the court papers that have been filed for a class action against Allbirds. So you know Allbirds, the company that, they make shoes, little New Zealand company that became $1 billion American company. When you go onto their website to buy their shoes, you can see all sorts of information about the carbon footprint that the shoes have. In fact, you can take into account that information in choosing which shoes you want to buy and whether you want to buy them at all. A class action has been taken alleging that, amongst other things, Allbirds is not telling the whole story, that they haven't taken into account sufficient information in the backstory about the supply and the transportation and contributed that to their carbon footprint count. Allbirds say that this is not right, and they have done that, so we'll see what happens with the class action. But it's interesting, you know, to see the lengths that people are willing to go if they think that they haven't been told the whole truth, if they think that there is greenwashing. Next slide, please. Earlier this month, Minta Allison produced a really interesting report about greenwashing, and I'd encourage you to take the time to have a look at it and have a read of it. It introduces you to what might be recognised as greenwashing, how you can manage, or how your clients can manage to avoid that label, the impacts of it. It comes out of Australia, it's Australian based, but it of course remains relevant to greenwashing generally, and certainly what's here in New Zealand. It's publicly available on the website for Mintas. The other picture there is from the Commerce Commission website. The Commerce Commission has got some specific guidelines that they've set out about environmental claims. I'm telling you about this so that you can be clear when you are talking to clients about climate change or thinking about the issues and what might be appropriate to put into your documents, that you can't, or clients can't, fake it till you make it with climate claims. You don't need to know everything in order, or they don't need to know everything in order to do something. You can take baby steps, but these steps need to be genuine. Let's have a look at the next slide. So with this in mind, have a think about why climate change might be relevant to you in your working life. Why might it be something that you might be interested in turning your mind to in relation to the advice you give and the drafting that you do? You're here, so we know that at least you are curious about this topic, but I want to acknowledge some of the difficulties that we each experience in answering these questions about why we should do it and how we should do it. Not to answer them, I'm afraid. I'm going to leave that to you. They're each questions for you to consider, but I do want to acknowledge the heft of it. The first point up there on the slide, you can see that on one side this is too scary for me to square up to. It's too big for me to have any influence. Climate change is too scary, often disguised as I'm way too busy. I've got too many other really important things to do. I'm just one person. New Zealand is a tiny place. Things seem to be okay going on down here. Infrastructure needs to change before I can make any difference. All valid issues. But the flip side of that discussion and that debate you might be having in your head is in a single sentence. This is too important not to do something. And as you ponder those two sides of the question about whether you're going to do anything or why you should do anything, as you ponder that debate, don't just think about it in the snippets of the time between the 1,000 other things that you've got to fill your day with. As well as that, sit on a mountain, walk on the beach, listen to the birds, watch your children play. Okay, so decisions made, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. And this is a really tricky point for lawyers, you know, I think. We're used to fully understanding things, we're trained to analyse, to research, to get to the real truth, the facts. We research, study, read before we even dare to express any expertise or an opinion. This subject of climate change is a bit different. It's going to take a shift in mindset to deal with it. It's going to be about asking questions in the giving of your advice, even if you don't know the answers. It's going to be up to you in your particular areas of law to ask rigorously, is climate change going to impact these obligations? Does climate risk impact or change anything in relation to this deal? What opportunities are there out there for there to be a change in thinking, a change in behaviour? To be frank, at first you might not even voice these questions out loud, but that doesn't matter. Just keep asking the questions. The next 2 points are a bit about being clear on what your role is as a lawyer. I get it that roles differ from client to client and sometimes they evolve organically. But be clear on whether you are a facilitator or a trusted advisor, or when you're being a facilitator and when you're being a trusted advisor. Quite a few people have said to me, my client doesn't want to hear about these things from me. And I've thought, are you sure? They'll definitely want to know about the risk side of things. And they're probably thinking about all of those big questions that you're thinking about too. Your first drafting for climate change opportunity is when you prepare and send your scope of services. Can we have the next slide, please? So when you're setting out the relationship between you and your client, if your client doesn't want you to address any impacts of climate change or to look at climate issues in their advice, then my advice to you is get that in writing, whatever the area of law is. Here's a list of things that I thought about. You'll have a much more detailed list that's relevant to your particular area of law. But these are things that go across all sorts of areas of law that I think are impacted by climate risk and by climate action. If your client doesn't want you to address any of these things, I really suggest that you get them to say that up front and put it in writing. So I'll hand back to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Debra. Good stuff. So businesses are evolving and we need to evolve with them. So we are seeing a shift in focus for businesses that were focused on maximising shareholder wealth, and they're now broadening their focus to other stakeholder interests. Those stakeholders include the consumers, their own people, their team, regulators and third parties, the communities in which they operate, and of course the environment. Some will be doing that because it's the right thing to do. Others will be doing it because they have to, or they feel they have to. And there are a number of push and pull factors at play. So there's the obvious physical risks to their business. So rising sea levels might impact on their premises, and they'll need to think about that. There'll be legal risks that they need to think about. As we mentioned before, the law is heading in the direction of more regulation, and it's starting with more disclosure. There'll also be liability risk. As Debra's just talked about, there's the risk that you might end up on the front page of the newspaper because there's some climate litigation risk against your client. These are the things that keep directors up at night. Increasingly, businesses are expected to contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they're choosing to measure their performance against those SDGs and therefore against their competitors. Consumers of products and services are demanding that businesses change and evolve, and reputations are at stake. Reputations to be seen to be leaders, as so many are now coming out with their voluntary adoption of mandatory reporting before it's mandatory, or choosing to be followers, or quite frankly being left behind, because it is becoming mainstream and it is becoming expected. Regulators and third parties are requiring it as well. On a recent IPO that we were involved with, NZX questions on the disclosure statement were probably 70% on ESG. In a recent interaction with a rating agency, they asked only questions about ESG factors. And these, if a rating agency is looking at your ESG factors or your client's ESG factors, it's going to have an impact on the cost of capital for that business. Speaking of capital, that is really focusing on ESG factors. So investors are looking for good quality ESG opportunities. They want their money to both have a financial return and have impact. And the way that they're looking for these opportunities is through the share market, through their KiwiSaver and other managed investment providers, private equity, so their LPs are requiring change, and that's the likes of, as I mentioned, super fund, which has been in the responsible lending space for a long time now. They are, leading with the requirements that they're having of their private equity, the funds that they invest in, and also high net worth individuals. They're very driven by impact investing. So capital is also, so they're through investors, but also through banks. Banks are using their balance sheets now to finance businesses that are focused on being greener and more sustainable. And we'll look more at sustainable finance in a minute. Anecdotally, global businesses are looking to acquire businesses with high ESG credentials. Some of them won't look at businesses that don't add to their, I think the balance is a little off, and so they're looking to rebalance through some of the acquisitions that they're doing. So smaller businesses with high ESG credentials are in good shape. Businesses that consider broader stakeholder interests do tend to be part of high performing and reliable supply chains. And in the competition for talent, they attract and retain talented people. There are also opportunities here. Necessity and ambition and focus is driving innovation, whether that's in processes, supply chains, new products, also efficiency. So there is and new markets. There's an alignment between doing the right thing for the planet and the other ESG factors, and also what's kind of good for business. Actually thinking about different ways of doing things can be good for the planet and good for business and drive efficiencies. So it's also the right thing to do, and that will drive some people. And in the case of our firm, our people are interested in it. Definitely, our clients are demanding it. They're talking about it. Clients are including it in their panel reviews. So we have to talk about what we're doing in the space and be upfront about it. Also, as Debra talked about, in that trusted advisor role, our clients are looking out into the future, and they're looking for our input on their future, not just on the law, but also on the things that we're talking about today. Also, as a firm, it's good to be carbon zero certified. It's easy, especially as there's no travel at the moment. And if there's one action point that those who are not carbon certified could take away today, then please think about becoming carbon zero certified. As I said, it's very easy. Ours is through Toitu EnviroCare, but there are others that also certify. So I'd just like to spend a few minutes on sustainable finance. If we could have the next slide, please. Oh, it was already there, thank you. So sustainable finance, so as I mentioned before, banks are focusing on financing businesses that are becoming greener and more sustainable. The global sustainable debt market was over 700 billion US last year. It's relatively new to the New Zealand market, but it's certainly fast growing. The sustainable finance teams at the banks are growing fast. They have targets for lending, and they're looking for good homes for that debt. So they're looking for businesses to support with that balance sheet that's allocated to sustainable finance. But this is going to be temporary. It will become the norm to require ESG performance from borrowers, because businesses that are doing well on ESG obviously have good governance and are doing well financially. So it's creeping in, whether you label it sustainable finance or not, it's creeping into the criteria that banks look at when they're looking at good credit. Sustainable finance works best when it's aligned with an overall sustainability strategy. And that sustainable finance market can be split basically into both the bond market and the loan market. So in the bond market, we have green bonds, and that's most of the issuances that are in the of bonds in this sustainable finance space on the debt capital markets. Green bonds fund existing or new projects that have an environmental benefit. For example, building green buildings, or renewable energy plants, or low carbon transport. You can also have social bonds. This is straying a little bit away from the climate remit, but also good to know about. Social bonds, these are in a high growth phase, particularly in the COVID era that we're in. They fund social projects. So that might be affordable housing or education. So they mitigate a social issue or achieve a social outcome. And sustainability bonds do a combination of both the green and social projects. So the Kāinga Ora Wellbeing bonds are an example of that, and they've issued over 5 billion New Zealand in the last 3 years of bonds. So that's certainly great for that developing sustainable bond market. Bonds or loans can be either use of proceeds or sustainability linked. Use of proceeds, loans or bonds, they are tied to particular assets. So the project is evaluated. There's tracking of the proceeds of the financing to make sure it lands in the green zone or for the green project. There's reporting on the use of that proceeds, and then this also demonstrates a commitment to green asset growth. Sustainability linked loans and bonds, on the other hand, they're for general corporate purposes, so there's no restriction on how the funds are used or the financing is used, but they're a set of sustainability performance targets are identified, and they're particular to the relevant borrower. There's usually 2 to 4 targets is about right for the number of SPTs that a loan might have, and the kind of usual one is, one of the usual ones is greenhouse gas emission reduction. Then the pricing is linked to those SPTs, those targets, and so the pricing could move up or down depending on whether the company meets those targets or not. And those will be stretch targets, so they won't be easy. That's not the intention. That would be greenwashing. And then there's reporting on progress against those targets and independent verification. That sort of reporting and verification process is usually annually. And the idea of this sort of financing is to incentivise improvement in sustainability performance. The great thing about this is it's about financing the transitioning from where we are now to where we need to be. All this financing does that. I'm enjoying reading that there's a development in this part of the market where that pricing adjustment, rather than, there might be some skeptics that think that that pricing adjustment isn't a true pricing adjustment, or what do the banks really do with it, but actually banks are moving to where there's a gain, so where the borrower doesn't perform against their targets and there's a benefit to the bank in that from the pricing. They're looking at the banks donating those gains, and likewise if the borrower benefits from pricing reduction because they have been performing their targets, then the idea is that the borrower will use that saving for further sustainability improvement, which is great. These things are all tied to some standards, and there are some standards that have been developed by the likes of the LMA and APLMA for setting out criteria for the likes of green bonds and loans, and things like the green bond principles, the sustainability linked loan principles, and the sustainability bond guidelines. As I understand it, because we're a bit behind the rest of the world on these sorts of things, over in particularly Europe, which is the more mature market, there really is developing a price differential for green bonds versus corporate bonds, which is to the issuer's advantage. So there are a lot of advantages to doing sustainable finance, and pricing is not necessarily seen to be the one that drives behaviour, but there is market evidence is showing that there is a price differential, which is terrific. As I said, sustainable finance is here now, but one day it will be mainstream and it will just be finance. Now just moving on to corporate and commercial, and some of the things that we're sort of seeing in the less finance transactions, but the more kind of corporate and commercial realm. Generally, we're moving more to disclosure, but we will be moving into consequences in the future, as with legislation. So in the M&A world, ESG is now a key concern for buyers of businesses. It's gone from a tick box exercise to actual substantive inquiry and reporting, including getting independent reports on environmental performance. They're being required. It's important to investors. When a purchaser is looking to buy a business, they're asking, what does the sustainability profile of this business look like, and how can we improve it? So our private equity clients, they need to go through an investment committee approval process, akin to a board of director approval process. And on the investment committee's list of things that they need to consider is ESG performance. So we're increasingly being asked to include ESG in our due diligence. For example, adding value to a business that exports things in a finished product form and having a good look at whether or not they really need to do it in that form, or whether it will be less environmental impact if they shipped in bulk and packaged at the destination. So that's things that, you know, that doesn't seem like an environmental thing, that sounds like a good business thing, but that's an example of where things can be aligned. It also affects the desirability of assets. So Ampol has made a takeover offer. An example of this is Ampol in Australia has made a takeover offer for Z Energy, and they've publicly said that they need to sell Gull in order to do that. But who wants to buy Gull? Not only are these assets dropping in value, but some of them are becoming liabilities. So there is a big impact on the M&A market in that respect. Also, recent changes to the Overseas Investment Act will have an impact. For an overseas person to acquire sensitive land, then there's to be a benefit to New Zealand. And recent changes mean that the factors that need to be considered include an increased focus on the environment. In the future, we might see some adjustments in sale and purchase agreements and M&A transactions where the purchase price might well adjust depending on assurances around carbon reduction or performance in the relevant periods in relation to carbon. So there might actually be a pricing adjustment that really reminds people about the importance of carbon reduction in these businesses. In IPOs, we're seeing in the same way as private equity and in the same way as private equity are interested in the impact of they want to understand the ESG factors or the ESG risks, so are investors in the capital markets through IPOs and, as we said, the bond market. We're seeing it in governance, so directors have duties to act in the best interests of their of the company or and they have to exercise reasonable skill and diligence in what they do. Debra's going to talk about this further, but there is a new bill being put before Parliament to expand those duties to take into account more stakeholders and a wider stakeholder group. But certainly we're seeing directors building climate goals into their decisions on significant transactions and contracts. And as I said, with investment committees of private equity, we're seeing that requirements of going through a process of checking the environmental credentials before entering into major transactions. Some constitutional documents, including company constitutions, limited partnership agreements, trust deeds, are also including clauses that relate to environmental goals. And we're seeing it also in policies that businesses adopt. For example, whistleblower policies and all sorts of other policies taking into account environmental factors. Insurance, where depending on the cover that is offered, and companies may need to, even if they're not under the mandatory reporting regime, may well need to undertake climate risk assessments and disclose their carbon emissions targets and climate risk exposure in order to get relevant cover under insurance policies, depending on the nature of their business. As I said, it's important to the people in our teams or in our clients' teams, and so it's sometimes being both built into employment agreements and built into KPIs of employees. So including employers providing and employees participating in climate education and linking bonuses and other incentives to climate-related performance. Commercial contracts are another area where the climate can be built in, and we can advance the cause of helping the planet through some of the suggestions that we can make in terms of the contracts that can be clauses that can be put into contracts. So a lot of that be around disclosure and reporting. Questioning and reporting can be useful tools in raising awareness of the issues and emphasising the importance, even if there's no kind of legal consequence. So asking stakeholders, suppliers, subcontractors to complete questionnaires about their performance on climate-related issues will in itself drive behaviour, because it shows what's important to the buyer of those goods and services. So some of those things are things that we can suggest to our clients to help better understand the risk of their wider profile of their business and the impact that it has. So this reporting could be periodic, could be public, identify climate risks and opportunities, set out their climate change policy, and identify the effects that all of these actions are taking on stakeholders, both if they do and don't reduce their emissions. To the extent they're not already doing so, climate-related obligations or climate-aligned obligations can be built into agreements so that the counterparties must also transition to net zero. So this is the influence that our clients can have, or we can help them to have over the supply chain, basically. So this could be right at the outset when heads of terms are agreed, they could explicitly refer to the parties discussing climate change adaptation and mitigation measures as part of their commercial purpose. And then when you get into the detail of how goods and services are provided, so for example, how a construction project is completed, what are the environmental requirements in relation to that project, in certain contexts, use of single-use plastic bags, trying to reduce those, supply agreements that might be in relation to producing products that have a carbon footprint budget, and carbon footprint of the products manufacturers has to reduce over time. So they need to get more efficiencies and more climate action to reduce those emissions over time. And requirements not only on the counterparties and the way they do things, but also going up the supply and value chains of the counterparties, so the spread reaches throughout the supply chain. I like this one. So maybe the idea of, in a supply contract, the right to terminate the contract if the counterparty can find a greener supplier. So it allows the customer to move to a greener supplier to meet their own sustainability or climate objectives if their current supplier is not meeting those targets. So some of the things that can be done are linking obligations to reducing carbon emissions over a specified period, establishing a sustainability committee of the board to oversee the sustainability strategy, signing up to any relevant green industry standards, and I think there are more of these overseas than we have here at the moment, but these will develop over time, as we've seen with the sustainable finance standards that have been developed. They're developing more at a global level or a kind of Asia Pacific level, but they are being developed. Obligations to provide training for employees and contractors, requiring climate action clauses to be included in standard form contracts or supply contracts. And these can be measuring, all these things can be measuring climate impacts, carbon emissions, water usage, also increasing diversity and inclusion, and all sorts of other measures that are part of the sustainability portfolio. We could also see governing law and arbitration clauses that require parties to resolve disputes in a manner that's consistent with the Paris Agreement. So using best available science and ensuring that disputes are resolved in a way that is better for the planet. I'll hand over now back to Debra to talk about property and wills and trusts.
Thank you, Nicole. There's a lot going on, hey? I'd like to talk specifically to those of you who act for clients who own property, to identify some issues that are relevant into how you might draft a range of agreements: sale and purchase agreements, development agreements, joint venture agreements, subdivision, documentation, construction contracts. You can think about how the different issues would fit in with the relevant parts of your practice. On the screen there, I've put a couple of addresses, internet addresses for you to use if you want to have a look at maps that identify impact of sea level rise. So this is a topic that's come up a little bit already, but whether a property is going to be subject to sea level rise or storm surges is definitely something that ought to be taken into account in assessing the risk, assessing its value, its insurability, its fund, whether it's able to be funded, etc. And it's something that ought to be part of your due diligence inquiries or on your list of things that, as giver of legal advice, you're telling your client about. So whether that's that you actually make those inquiries or whether you draw your client's attention to it and they're inclined to make those inquiries, that's over to you. But there's so much information around about this that it's a relatively easy thing to do, and I certainly think that, especially if you were arguing it in 5 or 10 years hence, it may very well be negligent not to providing this information. The maps that are provided that are referenced there come from 2 different places. The top one is actually an international one out of America that has maps for all over the world, and you can go on there and scroll through and see what things are going to be like in 100 years and 30 years and 50 years for the specific areas that you're interested in. And the second address is to the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment site. Aligned with that, with the sea level rise risk, is the risk of insurance retreat. And this too is something that there is plenty of information about, and that is something that in the ordinary course of events ought to be part of what a client might inquire about in relation to a property they're buying, or in fact selling, and what sort of representations are being made. There's been a lot written about the risk of insurance retreat, retreat particularly of the international insurers from the New Zealand, from certainly New Zealand properties. And the photograph there is of the front page of a report that was done at the end of last year. It was done by the Deep South National Science Challenge. They've done a lot of work in this issue and produced quite a bit of material about it. It's an analysis, or looking at the major cities in New Zealand and the risk of insurance retreat within the residential sector there. Again, something that's worthwhile having a look at. The third thing there on the list is understanding emissions budgets and the associated advice. So you'll know that the Climate Change Commission put out made their advice publicly available earlier in the year, and it's being considered, and it's a massive document, you know, a lot for you to read and take on board, but it has an executive summary, and there are plenty of commentaries on the advice around. And I would certainly encourage you to have a level of understanding about what is in there, because the things that are suggested that are in there, the advice that's given, will impact on the property industry, will impact on all sorts of things relevant to the sale and purchase and the development, the sale and purchase of land and the development of land. To meet the expectations that are set in there, there need to be innovations in material and technology, new skills that will need to be taken on board. But one of the tools that will undoubtedly be used in meeting the expectations around limiting transportation, around the reductions in use of energy and electricity, will be planning requirements, will be how we build the communities that we live in, and building those to meet the sorts of expectations that that the carbon emissions budgets have. What's in those budgets too will be relevant to consumer expectations, and that is part of the bigger picture, and Nicole's talked quite a bit about that already, about what people are expecting and wanting. And again, I think that this is a relevant place to find what might be coming forward in relation to that. These emission budgets are something that we're going to live with now. You know, we'll have shortly the first 3, and they'll keep on rolling, and the expectations about the carbon emissions that will be allowed under them will only get more and more tough. So seeing what might be expected in the future can be extremely useful in decision making and guiding contractual expectations. Megan, can we have the next slide, please? Another thing that I would really encourage you to get your head around is MBIE's Building for Climate Change program. So this has been around for a couple of years now, at least as far as consultation documentation has been involved in the evolution of it. And I've put there the address where you can go and see the information about the climate change program. And in case you don't know, the program falls into 2 parts. Both of them deal with the reduction and ultimately the elimination of carbon emissions from buildings. One relates to carbon emissions that come from a building while it operates and while it's being used, it exists, but the other is far more far-reaching and covers the entire life of a building. So the idea is that all of the different elements that go into a building will be, the carbon emissions that come from them will be identified, measured and reduced. And this will be in a step-through process, but will be happening over time. So from the felling of the tree to the destruction of the building at the end of its life. I've heard from MB tells us that by the end of the year, perhaps, hopefully, we'll hear from them about some sort of time frame for when these things will be coming into play. I guess things have been railroaded a little bit with COVID and the energy that's gone into that. But one thing that is for sure is that this program is coming. It's not just an idea that won't see the light of day. It's something that we can, it's something that I really encourage you to find out about and to know and to understand. It's not difficult to read the material that's available on MB's website, but also the photograph there is something that's on my website. It's a template of questions that I put together to help people who are in the position of providing legal advice to address issues that come out of the proposed climate change building for climate change program. So it's there just as a tool. It's free to download. If you want to do it, please go and have a look at my website and take it away with you and use it as you would like to use it. The climate change program is going to impact on what can be built. It's going to impact too on the cost of that building. It'll cause your clients who are in this industry to be thinking about new skills, innovative technology, new types of people that are not new types of people, new types of skills that those people will have who are working with them. But it's also going to impact on your documents too. One of the ways that recently I came across it was a description and document about what was good industry practice and whether good industry practice shouldn't take into account these types of issues in progressing the building. But one way that it's relevant probably right now today in your inbox and on your files is the way that you draft your land covenants or what you see as acceptable within your land covenants. Traditionally, when we're doing subdivision documents, we create land covenants that regulate the size of houses. We provide for large houses rather than small ones. They're kind of looking at value. We prohibit construction off-site and bringing things onto the property. We prohibit the reuse of property, of materials, requiring new materials to be used. All of these are things that don't fit with the Building for Climate Change program, which emphasises the reuse of materials, which anticipates innovative technology that constructs off-site and brings things into place, that anticipates smaller housing. And I put grass height in there too, not because it's got anything at all to do with MB's Building for Climate Change program, but because it's often in land covenants. Now we see land covenants that say that the grass has got to be no more than 10 millimetres high. But, you know, short grass, it turns out, isn't actually that good for the environment. Can we see the next slide, please? Okay, so let's just have a look at some clauses that relate to contracts across the board, not just in the property area. And when it comes to the clauses at the back end of your contracts, have a think about them too in the context of climate action, in the context of climate risk, climate change. And there are two of them here that I've set up that I specifically want to talk about. The first is force majeure. And I guess at this time, you're kind of used to actually looking at force majeure clauses and considering them in the context of COVID. You know, for years and years, we've just kind of slotted them into the documents and perhaps not given them much thought, but that might have changed recently. Turn your mind to them again and think about the impacts of climate change. How might storms, floods, droughts, and fires impact these issues, impact supply, impact safety in the workplace, impact insurance, the ability to insure, impact accessibility of sites and work sites, places of work. And the photograph that you've got there is a picture that I've taken of my shoes. And I've taken it to remind me to tell you the story about buying these shoes. So I bought them in August 2020 and they got delivered to me a couple of weeks ago. I knew that it would take a little while because I bought them on Kickstarter. So, you're kind of up front there, and there's quite a lot needs to happen before the shoes, or whatever it is that you're investing in or buying, get delivered. But there was a significant delay in the delivery of these shoes. And the delay was because they're made from pineapple. And the plantation of where the pineapple was to be sourced was severely damaged in a massive storm. And as a result, I got my shoes months and months later than I had ordinarily expected to receive them. So shoes have got nothing to do with property, and probably not much to do with your contracts, but they've come up a couple of times actually. That's the third shoe story in the course of this webinar. Force majeure provisions or your delay events provisions will likely refer to acts of God. Take a minute to think about whether the impact of climate change is an act of God. Climate change is man-made, it's foreseeable, and it's able to be slowed by taking reasonable action. None of those things sound like acts of God. In fact, they all run afoul of the common law expectations of an act of God. When you're looking at this provision too, think about how contractually you might deal with the risks associated with these things and the impacts on the supply, safety, insurance, accessibility, etc., from things to do with climate action. Does cancellation actually give an effective outcome? And especially given that we'll see more and more of delays and difficulties, that disruptions will become our norm. Let's have a look then at dispute resolution. And Nicole just referred to this actually in the comments about incorporating climate clauses into arbitration provisions or dispute resolution provisions. So often our standard dispute resolution, struggling on the words, dispute resolution provisions are based around financial outcome. And that may remain the most appropriate benchmark. And it may not. Make sure that you and your client choose that benchmark rather than defaulting to it, especially if there are climate conscious expectations about your contract that you've drafted. Is it appropriate to take into account those outcomes as well as the financial outcomes in the dispute resolution? And those people that you've identified as experts in helping to resolve the disputes, do they have expertise in the right area, or is it in too narrow an area? Do they have the expertise to take into account climate issues in your decision making? Thanks. Let's have a look at the next slide. Okay, so I want to turn briefly to talk about a few things that might be useful or interesting to take into account when dealing with trusts and wills. Where you might, or what you might think about in understanding the legal expectations that there are on trustees around moral decisions to do with climate change and otherwise, and around decisions to do with financial benefit and the weighing up of those two. And I also have a think, I have a bit of a chat about what opportunities trusts and wills create for proactive action. And that might be action by you as an advisor, action by your clients as set laws, by them as trustees, and even those who are no longer here, actions by those who are making a will. I've listed this presentation with various photos, and they're just photos that I've taken along the way throughout the country. I thought it might be nicer than just looking at the words. Let's have a look at the next slide, Megan. Cool. So first of all, a little bit of discussion around the legal duties of trustees. And again, I want to tell you about work that others have done. Earlier on in the year, Chapman Tripp produced an opinion addressing the responsibilities of trustees. Nicholas Swan was one of the authors, together with barrister Daniel Calderemus, I think, I hope. I hope that's right if you're there, Daniel. So you might have heard of a previous opinion that these two did too. Both of these opinions were prepared for the Aotearoa Circle. The first opinion was in relation to directors' responsibilities about climate risk. And you may very well have come across this because it's been very influential and widely used. This latest opinion, it's publicly available. You can download it from the Aotearoa Circle website. You can also get it via the Chapman Tripp website. It's not available there just to download, but they invite you to email if you want it as well. It examines, amongst other things, what trustees are expected to know about climate risk, and whether trustees can manage that climate risk in relation to the trust assets, and actually whether they're obliged to manage that. It then raises a question too about whether trustees can base their decisions on climate change rather than a financial impact, and make moral decisions rather than purely financial ones. So the first thing about a trustee is expected to know about climate risk. First of all, I'd encourage you to read it. It's 22 pages of easy to read, punchy, robust discussion. And anybody who is practicing in this area, or who might be a trustee themselves, or who might be a director of a corporate trustee, take the time to read it and have a think about the things that are in there. It's clear from this opinion that the expectation is that trustees should know about climate risk. They should be able to expect and identify, they should be able to identify and assess climate-related financial risk and to determine whether it's likely to be material as a consequence to take into account in their decision-making. It may be too that they can manage climate risk, but the opinion really does recognise the benefit from identifying that sort of obligation, that mandatory expectation within the trust documentation, whether that's in the trust or in the memorandum of wishes. And whether trustees can base decisions on climate change risk rather than the financial impact is something that's not quite so clear at the moment. In the opinion, there's discussion about a court case that's underway at the moment where exactly this issue is being considered. It's in Britain, and no doubt we'll hear more about the decision there and the resolution. Go to the next slide, please. But there might be things too that can be done in a proactive sense. If you or your clients are wanting to take some sort of action, some climate action as a trustee or as an advisor of trustees. The first point that's up there is about the impartiality provisions that are in a trust document. You're going to be talking to your clients, I'm sure, who are putting in place trusts or changing their trusts about impartiality between the different beneficiaries within a trust. So your standard trust deeds that we know and love and use in our practices probably provides for generations of beneficiaries. The people who set it up, their children, their grandchildren, and maybe anybody else that's here, that's there. As part of setting up that document, you're likely to talk through with your client whether any of those beneficiaries are going to be looked after to a greater extent than the others. And in the absence of deciding that they are, my understanding is that there's an obligation for impartiality between those beneficiaries. When you're talking about that, throw climate change into that conversation and see what pops out. Have a think too about whether your trustee clients want to be able to take climate risk into account in their decision making. So when they are taking on board any sorts of decisions that the trust might make, do they want to be clearly able to account for the impact of climate change? And that might be climate risk from a point of view of managing climate risk, or it might be even further than that, to take into account actual climate action in their decision making, to make decisions that go beyond what might be financially the best. Talk to your clients about that too. at least ask them whether they want that sort of thing in their trust document or whether they want that sort of thing in the memorandum of wishes that they're writing. Give them a clear mandate. And what about you? On what terms will you be a trustee? How will your decisions impact climate change? Many of us who practice are trustees, not so much personally, but as directors of corporate trustee companies. And it's a job that gets harder and harder, doesn't it? But I wonder, is this your opportunity to influence decision-making? Could you make it a requirement of your being willing to provide a corporate trustee that the company constitution enables climate-conscious decision-making? And before you say companies can't do that, Nicole's already mentioned this Companies Directors' Duties Amendment Bill that was introduced just last month to the House. Can we have the next slide, please? It's just a short little bill, and I have to say that it pains me to see the absence of the apostrophe in the name. But I must remind myself that, you know, there are bigger things at stake. So it's just a short little bill, but you'll see there that it says that it introduces an amendment that says to avoid doubt starts. So the expectation is this is the law already, hey? To avoid doubt. The director of a company may, when determining the best interests of the company, take into account, see there be, reducing adverse environmental impacts. Okay, I think that on that point, I'm going to hand back to Nicole. Oh no, I've got a little bit more. Yeah. Okay, so let's have a look at the wheels. Thank you for raising this. This is a picture of my car. There's a lot of shame associated with this picture, not least of which is because it's stuck on a 2.5 foot high wall there. That's down at the viaduct. You can't really tell from the photo, but it was a terrible night. It was raining and windy, and just out of the picture, there's a whole bunch of roadworks with lights and cones and signs all over the place. And, you know, it was really hard to identify where the exit was. I hadn't been drinking, but I did take the wrong route. Anyway, that's not why the car is there. It's just a good story. Why the photo's there. It's just a good story associated with that car. I love that car. I really, really like it. I've had it since I was new. It was new. I bought it without any thought of carbon emissions. I bought it because I needed to put boys and bikes and skateboards and surfboards and stuff in the back and transport people all around the place. And now I don't know what to do with it. I'm really struggling about what I should do with my car. I don't want to sell it because then somebody else will use it. I try not to use it very much at all. I don't even want to sell it for parts because then the parts will be put into other cars to make those cars last for longer. I've seriously been thinking about wrecking it. I can't quite bring myself to do that in the moment. Recently, I was changing my will. Well, just like most of you, I haven't quite finished it, but it's just over there and I will change it. And I was thinking about fossil fuel cars in the context of my will. And I decided I put a provision into the will that says that any fossil fueled vehicle that I own at the date of my death is to be wrecked. So that gave me with an out. I hope I don't die for a long time and don't have to deal with it. But I thought, oh, that's something that perhaps other people might use too. Someone's suggesting an off-road rally or a demolition derby. That would be a great idea. Let's do that. Everybody wants to get rid of their car. Another thing that I'm quite interested in putting into my will is around repayment of debts. And here I'm talking about carbon debts. So it's really typical, normal, in fact, we always do it, to put into a will that all debts will be repaid from the estate. What about putting something in the will that says that a calculation will be made of the likely carbon emissions that the testator has generated during their life and to offset them from the assets in the estate? So this can be done. It would need to be done based on a whole bunch of assumptions and norms and, you know, what's typical over particular years. But this is information that can definitely be calculated and worked out. And actually, it might be expensive. And actually, it might in the future be a lot more expensive than it is now. It might be useful too within the world to create some sort of guidance about decision making for those who are left behind and who are managing your assets. Guidance to those people about what recognition you want to give about looking after the planet and environmental decisions. Guidance about no harm decisions, guidance about prohibiting certain investments or certain goals that you might have in place. I skipped over one about prerequisites for gifts. People have been putting prerequisites for receiving a gift into their wills for years. The property relationship agreements are a really good example about how they do that. And it's up to you about whether you like it or whether you don't like it. But prerequisites for gifts about how funds are to be spent or what sort of assets might be purchased or what sort of environmental decisions are made in investment in choosing investments might also be another area that could be looked at. This time I think I really have got to the end of my presentation and I'm going now to hand back to Nicole, who's going to take any questions and answers and give some answers.
Thanks, Debra. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ideally put them in the Q&A. We have a question in the chat. Now let me just see if I can access that.
That might be a question for me. That's Bram asking about the use of my car.
Sounds like your car.
No, my car. Okay. Would it be more carbon efficient to use the existing car at the end of its life before consuming a newly manufactured electric vehicle, i.e. given the car embodied carbon in car manufacturing irrespective of engine type? And people are saying, yes, they agree. So that may very well be the case, actually. And in response to a similar question, I was presented with a whole bunch of material recently showing that actually, yeah, there are problems with electric vehicles, but they are overall, and taking into account the big picture, they are more energy efficient than using the existing cars. But a couple of things about that. The first is how efficient it is to retain the car is going to depend on how much I use it or you use your car. The answer to all of these questions is about using cars. Electric cars are not the answer to the problem. They're only a stepping stone to help you make a hard decision, that is to get out of your car. The answer to the problems are other things: public transport, bikes, walking, scooters, something else. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Yes, thanks, James. Your car is attracting a lot of attention, Debra. Your car dilemma.
I really like the Derby one. I think that's great. We could have maybe for the next festival, next year, we could run an event. Everybody who wants to get rid of their car can come to the car derby and they'll all be wrecked at the end.
Sounds like a plan. Certainly be entertaining and draw a crowd. Does anyone have any questions? We've also got Michael's joined us as well, who focuses more on kind of corporate and commercial than I do. I focus more on the finance side in our team, but and Debra's obviously previously a property lawyer, so we've sort of got a range of backgrounds to draw on. So if anyone has any questions for us, then please let us know. Still kind of silent, so that's cool. Thanks for the feedback in the chat, everyone. It's great to hear that you've got some things to think about there. Thank you all. I'll just wrap up now. Thank you all for joining us. My thanks also to Debra for instigating this. I have to pay her back sometime. I hope you all this has given you all some ideas about what is relevant to your clients and to your own business and how you can make an impact through the advice that you give and the role that you have as a trusted advisor to your clients, or if you're in-house, to the business that you work for. There's some great resources out there. If you have any further ideas, we're kind of giving you some of our ideas, but if you have any further ideas or would like to talk more, our contact details are up on the screen now, and we're also very easy to find online. CPD points, we have looked into this and we believe that we meet the criteria for it, so please do take a note of your registration and keep that for your CPD records. So now I think a reminder to join Alcanzi and to join the Chancery Lane project if you've got an interest in it. If you're not already, get Carbon Zero certified, or even better, the new Toitu Climate Positive certification is available. I'm going to learn more about that in a webinar shortly. I hope you enjoy, we hope you enjoy the rest of the Auckland Climate Festival. There are lots of excellent sessions available, which I'd really encourage you all to register for. There's loads on there. I did a composting workshop over the weekend, which really inspired me. So I'm going to do more, I think, around the home on that. So thanks all for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.
Cheers. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks.